if you speak up a bit when you actually talk.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to New America. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the director of our Fellows Program at New America, as well as the co-director of our Future Tense program, which is a collaboration with Slate Magazine and Arizona State University, which explores a lot of cutting-edge technology questions and how technology intersects with public policy, which is a inquiry that's very much aligned with a lot of what Michael has been working on, and I think that's how we actually first met through Joel Garreau, who's the co-director of that program. Also, I just, as a housekeeping matter, want to remind everybody that this session is being webcast, so it's on the record, and we will have time at the end for questions, but mindful of the fact that it's being webcast, please wait for a microphone if you want to make a comment or ask a question and identify yourself. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you as well, Michael, and congratulations on the book. Michael Chorost, for those of you who don't know, is a technology theorist. I love that. How does one get a license as a technology theorist? And he has written this great book, which is called Worldwide Mind, The Coming Integration of Humanity, Machines, and the Internet. And I should ask you if the subtitle will change, as it did with your first book, when it gets into a paperback. Because Michael is also the author of Rebuilt, How Becoming Part Computer Made Me More Human, which came out in 2005, was it? 2005? And the question about the subtitle has to do with the fact that when it came out in paperback, the subtitle became My Journey Back to the Hearing World. And I thought that was sort of an interesting transition, and I think it's a nod to the fact that you're so versatile, and I'm supposing that different editors at different publishing houses saw this book as somebody must have seen it as a tech book, and somebody must have seen it as a liberal arts philosophical tract, and a lot of your writing, I think, bridges those two realms, including this book. Michael has taught many places, has written everywhere, and I'll spare us the formal introduction and dive into the substance. So why don't you, if you want, Michael, just sort of set the scene and talk about how one project sort of led to another. Your book, Rebuilt, 2005, deals a lot with your voyage, so to speak, having gone completely deaf in 2001, and what it was like to have this computer essentially implanted in your brain, and how that, your return to the hearing world, so to speak. So if you want to just talk a little bit about the transition from Rebuilt to this new book.
Sure, that's a great way to lead into this kind of question. Let me just start by telling a little story. So in Rebuilt, in my first book, I tell the story of being in group therapy, which is something that every graduate student should do because graduate school sucks. So at that time, I was wearing hearing aids. And I was using this kind of radio transmitter that would allow me to hear the other people in this circle. So basically, everybody had to pass around this radio transmitter, which would send a radio signal directly to a radio receiver that I was wearing that plugged into my hearing aids. And I used this device because I couldn't hear the people on the other side of the circle with my hearing aids. So after a while, I had this session where the battery in the transmitter died. I thought, okay, I won't be able to hear anybody. But I found that I could hear them. And that was because as the group therapy had gone on, I learned to feel connected to them. So that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, that hearing and understanding are inextricably intertwined, that you can't just separate them. So in Rebuilt, I write about going deaf and learning how to hear again with the Cochlear Implant. But what it did was, it really burned my life down, the experience of going deaf. And I had to learn how to hear all over again. But I realized that the only way I would really be able to hear people would be to learn how to connect with them in that same way. So that's what my books are about. They're about using technology to forge new kinds of connection. And that's why my books are hard to subtitle, because they're hard to categorize. So as you say, they are this blend of science, technology, personal narrative, and philosophy. So Worldwide Mind takes off the Rebuilt, basically, in that I was thinking, okay, I now know what an ear implant can do for the peripheral nervous system. It can feed data to the auditory nerves and create a simulacrum of hearing. can that be done with the brain? So that was the question that launched Worldwide Mind.
Right. And I guess I'm tempted to cut to what is the answer. But one of the things that's striking in reading your book is how optimistic I think you are, or at least it seems to me, in terms of your sense that these technologies can enhance our humanity. And that seems to be sort of a bit of a somewhat of a contrarian thesis these days. I mean, we have Sherry Turkle's book about being alone and how we can, the more we can expect from our technologies, it means the less we can expect from each other. You, in a very personal way, have had to rely, we're all, I'm sure most of us in the room are hooked to one form of technology or another. The Wall Street Journal recently had a checklist of, you're in trouble as an addict if you do, one of the following things. And one of them was, check your BlackBerry before you say good morning to your kids. And I was like, oh, that's guilty. So we're all very dependent on certain technologies, and you have a very, very humorous takes on people's relationships to their iPhones, BlackBerries. You even call the iPhone erotic, so we can come back to that. But obviously, you rely on technology in a way that most of us can't begin to imagine. And so, in some sense, perhaps you're ahead of the curve, and yet you're very optimistic. At a time when we're surrounded by a lot of these, people writing that the technology is taking over, and it's all going to be about the technology, and technology makes us less human. So, talk a little bit about that. Am I misreading you in getting a sense that you feel that these technologies can actually enhance our humanity at the end of the day?
I am optimistic. I'll explain where that optimism comes from. So Sherry Turkle's book is a good launching point, Alone Together, because that is an almost despairing book. It's mostly anecdotal, but she tells these very profound anecdotes of teenagers getting into the car and they can't start talking to their parent until the parent finishes what they're doing on their BlackBerry. So it's funny because Turkle's first two books were very optimistic, life on the screen,
right,
by creating new ways of being. And this book is almost a cry of despair. So Turkle's not alone in writing that kind of book. There's also Bowling Alone, for example,
right,
by Robert Putnam, which kind of set the pace for that kind of discussion. So there's this whole flock of Cassandra kind of books. And then there are other people who say, well, technology is basically going to create sort of a superhuman singularity. And that's where the crazy techno-optimist group. But there's no middle ground. There is no center set of people who are saying there is a way to integrate technology into our lives to make us better people. So what I do in the book is I do a thought experiment. So basically I say, why does the internet seem to alienate us? And one reason is it is separate from our bodies. When you pick up your BlackBerry, before you say hello to your kids, you're focused on the screen, and therefore you are not paying attention to the rest of the world. So the question that I ask Worldwide Mind is, can we integrate the internet into our bodies so that online experience becomes as immediate and as felt and as interpersonal as face-to-face experience? Now, when I started the book, I was prepared to come to the conclusion of, no, that's never going to be possible. The ineffability of feelings, of consciousness, of sensory perception, that can never be conveyed to other people in all its richness. So I was all set for that book to be basically a cautionary tale. We can never do these things. To my astonishment, as I was exploring these really exotic advanced technologies like optogenetics, which I talk about at length in the book, I started to realize that there are some ways in which you can take a stab at doing just that. So I won't go into the science deeply right now, but so there were 2 points of optimism for me. The first point was it is now becoming conceptually possible to talk about intimate connection using electronics. Not physically possible, but conceptually possible. And I think that's so exciting and interesting and worth talking about. The second point of optimism is that I argue that the way to overcome internet addiction is to train people to communicate. And that is something that we don't do in our society. We teach kids trigonometry and history and science, but we don't teach them how to pay attention to another person empathetically. So in Worldwide Mind, there is this sub-theme where I take these communication workshops where I actually learn how to actually sit and give my undivided attention to another human being. And for me, that was such a profound experience that it gives me this optimism that this can be taught. We just have to decide to teach it.
Yes, Michael talks about going to I guess it's a retreat, and one of the exercises is you're forced to look into someone's eyes for it was 2 minutes, and I was kind of feeling awkward about it reading it because you're right. I mean, we were never not awkward, but I mean, just that exercise would be pretty powerful. And I mean, I have a 6-year-old son, the one I ignored in favor of my BlackBerry. And you know, they're not taught at school how to listen. I mean, they're taught to listen to the teacher, but empathy is something that you're clearly working on, and that's something that we're not. You know, we're sort of expected to be socialized in these traits. But you in the middle of your answer, you said that you were setting out to explore whether this could be done. And you know, that's clearly somewhat separate from the question of should it be done. You know, if there were technologies available to have a Facebook implant where we wouldn't have the detachment, physical detachment from the internet, but in our brains we had this instant sense of what, you know, all our hundreds of friends on Facebook are doing at any moment. Should we do that?
Well, that would have been a bit like asking, should we have Facebook and should we have Twitter before they existed? In fact, the move of the social network is a little bit about those questions in some way. So the approach that I suggest is really fairly similar to what we can do now, which is control people's access to you on Facebook. You know, Facebook has been criticized for playing fast and loose with some of its privacy policies, but nonetheless, you can control who gets to look at your page, what they see, how that information gets used, and you simply have to come up with a higher version of those technologies if you're creating a direct brain-to-brain kind of connection.
Right.
So you could not just turn the technology loose. You would have to have some kind of social structures, and we're already beginning to build those in the sense that we're building a sense of what we do in Facebook, a sense of what is public and what is private.
But do you think if we could implant that awareness, we would be sort of higher social beings, if that's the right term, in the sense that, you know, it's not a question. I'm not questioning so much sort of Facebook's privacy policies, although that is an issue, but in terms of the extent to which we become immersed in the network, as opposed to, I mean, where do you draw these boundaries? You know, it used to be that, you know, you had the wireline phone and you had to pay dearly to pick it up and call somebody, and now you constantly have it on your hand, and we're going to have it in our brains, and I don't know. These are powerful questions.
Well, you can say that one of the big concerns for society right now is boundary questions. Right. So as you say, these iPhones and BlackBerries have really torn down the boundary between work life and personal life. You know, there are stories, which Cherry Turkle tells, of parents giving their kids 2 cell phones to camp, one for the camp to confiscate, the other for the kid to have. And Cherry Turkle's question is, does the kid get a chance to individuate themselves if they can be texting their parent 20 times a day to ask questions? So boundaries are a big issue in our society. And I think that's one reason why the workshop part of the book presses so many buttons, because looking in someone's eyes is a very boundary challenging kind of exercise. Nobody's forced to do it, by the way. You know, all these exercises are done by a person's choice. But I think we have such difficulty with intimacy in our society that we find discussions of these issues very threatening and very scary. So it's interesting because the New York Times gave me a very positive review of the book, except for that part of the book. And I think that's because these questions of boundaries and intimacy push a real hot button in our society. So to come back to your question, should we do such a thing? Well, that's really a question to answer on the level of each individual, right? Each person decides whether to use Facebook. My wife is not on Facebook. It's kind of mind-blowing. I think she is the last person in the Western Hemisphere who is not on Facebook.
I'm with her, actually.
Okay. Anyway, but she chooses not to do it, so she has made that kind of decision. And other people are on it all the time. And my answer to that is not so much that society chooses, but we need to educate people in how to be communicative and how to be intimate. And until we do that, these questions are going to continue to be dealt with as a society.
Right. Just on a personal note, I actually I found your writing about your quest for love and going to the retreat, and also some of your kind of everyday takes on what it's like to bring in your sick BlackBerry to the store, and you made the comparison to going to the vet with a sick pet. To read Michael's book, you're reading very entertaining, magazine-like reading, and that everybody can relate to, and then sort of seamlessly segue into very high concept scientific explanations. And I thought that was what made the book incredibly powerful. And I was struck reading the New York Times review, which was very positive, you're right. But it seemed like, I forget who reviewed it, but he or she was sort of annoyed by some of the personal stuff, which I thought really takes Michael's writing to a different level and makes it so that, something that people can really relate to. It's like the New York Times wanted a drier, tech book. So that's, Michael didn't make me, we didn't arrange that plug in advance. This is
well, when I wrote the book, I knew that not everyone would appreciate that part of the book. Okay,
right.
It's just,
and it's courageous to write about yourself, and kudos to you for doing it. And it makes some people uncomfortable.
I thought long and hard about whether to do it. But to sort of make a little detour into writer talk for a moment, what I was trying to do in the book was to do really a new kind of science writing, where writing about the science was a way of writing about communication. Where writing about communication in these stories that I tell was a way of setting the stage for the science and actually explaining some of the science by explaining why it's important, by explaining why it's significant to us. So I'm trying to interweave these two kinds of writing. So there's a lot of great science books out there. We have sort of alternation of memoir and science. Eric Kandel's book is a great example of that. He won the Nobel Prize back in, I think, 2000 for his research on memory. So he's got this wonderful book, In Search of Memory, where he's got these anecdotes of growing up in Nazi-occupied Austria, for example, and doing his lab work. Then there's all these parts about just how memory works. And they pretty much alternate. I was trying to do a kind of writing where you don't get that kind of sharp distinction, where reading about science is reading about communication, where reading these stories about my life is reading about the science. So in the book, I felt like it was about 70% successful in making that happen. In the third book, I want to try to really get that down, to really make it seamless.
Right. And I think the part of the value of that, I mean, it's an interesting challenge for you as a writer, but I think in terms of the substance, it conveys this, I was taking it perhaps as this optimism that I referred to earlier, that this technology is a means towards an end, and that it's not, the end all, and that, I think the way that you've structured the book, and by talking about your personal life, it conveys that. It telegraphs the fact that this stuff is only cool if it's going to make us more fulfilled as humans. Maybe we should segue for 1 second and talk a little bit about your implants. Just just talk a little bit about the technology. I was very struck by your descriptions of how, first of all, just the sophisticated technology that is entailed, and how this, the type of implant that you have would have been so unthinkable not that long ago, which is sort of instructive in terms of thinking about, some of the stuff we were talking about earlier and how implausible that might seem today. But, come 20 years from now, who knows?
So let me just kind of run down my personal history. So I was born in 1964, and my mother had rubella when she was pregnant with me. So I like to say that I was in the right place at the wrong time, the wrong place at the right time, whatever. So I was born with severe hearing losses in both ears, which was not recognized until I was about 3 years old. So I got hearing aids, and I picked up English quite rapidly after that. So hearing aids gave me some ability to hear, but I was always a person with a hearing loss. So communication and intimacy have always been issues for me. So that's part of the background of both of my books. That is part of the way I grew up, where communication was always a struggle. Not just understanding another person's words, but connecting with them as well, feeling included in groups. It was always an issue for me. So when I was 36, in the year 2001, I suddenly lost all the remaining hearing in my good ear. I thought my batteries had died. I changed the batteries, didn't help. I switched my hearing aids, that didn't help. So then I went to the emergency room. So my good ear had just suddenly died, cause unknown. I got a cochlear implant about 3 months later, and I actually brought one along. So if you in the audience are curious, you can actually come up and take a look at this after the talk. So this is the cochlear implant that is in my left ear. So it's a little ceramic thing. So there's a computer chip inside there. So the thing is countersunk into my skull underneath the skin. So there's no break in the skin itself. So this looks like a hearing aid, but it's really just a computer. So this takes in sound, that digitizes it into a string of ones and zeros. That's the lithium-ion battery that powers the system. And this is a radio transmitter. And this sends a string of ones and zeros to the implant, to which it sticks magnetically like that. And this is embedded in my skull on the other side of the skin. And it sends those ones and zeros to a string of 16 electrodes that are curled up inside my inner ear. And those electrodes make the auditory nerves send sound signals to the brain, which my brain has learned to interpret as sound. Yeah. So that's basically how a cochlear implant works. Now, the thing for me was, when I had it turned on for the first time, what I heard was incomprehensible. It was gibberish. It sounded like language.
It was like Dutch.
It was like Dutch. Yeah, I mean,
Dutch sort of sounds like English, but it kind
or Esperanto or Klingon or whatever. So I would turn on the radio, it would sound perfectly language-like, but nothing happened in my head as I listened to it. Right. And of course, that was just terrifying, right? But gradually, over the next year, bits and pieces of it started becoming more clear. I trained myself by using, I started with Winnie the Pooh books on tape, read by Michael Chorost. So I would listen to the tape along with the book until I could pretty much get it down. Then I would listen to another one without the book. And after a while, I started to realize it doesn't sound like language, but I know what Piglet is doing. I know that he's stuck in a tree with the water rising around him. It wasn't quite clear how I was getting this information because it didn't feel like hearing. But gradually, my brain started to integrate it, and I learned how to hear all over again.
And so does this make you...
more human?
Not more human, but I mean in terms of, the system you described is so complex, and does this make you more optimistic about what might be possible technologically 15, 20 years from now? I mean, what are we going to, how are most of us going to be taking in technology, so to speak, and internalizing this worldwide mind? Give us sort of a timeline, and what companies we should invest in.
Well, yeah, I can't tell you about companies because the companies that build this technology, just don't exist yet. Well, first, there is a sharp distinction to be made between restorative neurotechnologies that ameliorate some loss, like in my case, and enhancement neurotechnologies, which just don't exist yet. And there's a big question whether they would actually ever become possible. So in Worldwide Mind, I don't say that things will happen.
Right.
What I do is I set the book up as a thought experiment. I say that it's now possible to conceptually talk about how it could be done for the first time, using technologies that have just been, or rather scientific insights, that have just been made in the last 5 years. That's mind-blowing. I mean, it's becoming possible in the lab to identify the specific neurons associated with a mouse's concept of nest. So when a mouse sees its nest, we know which neurons fired. And then when those neurons fire, we know the mouse has sighted its nest or is thinking about its nest. So we're starting to be able to suss out that linkage between specific mental events and the neural circuits that fire when those things are experienced or remembered. So in the book, I talk about these technologies that are making it possible to do this. Optogenetics is the genetic, or rather it's where you genetically modify neurons so that they respond to light. You do all these exotic things with the technology to make it theoretically possible to pick out specific memories. It's mind-blowing stuff. But anyway, when this will ever actually happen, that's a different question. You might say that it's a kind of a poetic response to Sherry Turkle's cry of despair in Alone Together, to say that, we can at least begin to think about ways in which technology would enhance our lived experience rather than taking away from it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you define the worldwide mind? I mean, I've read your book. I kind of know what you're talking about, but what's your kind of elevator pitch in terms of defining this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would start by defining it as an epiphenomenon, as basically a collective intelligence that emerges out of the sum total of millions or billions of individual volitional acts. Mm-hmm. So the obvious analogy is the ant hive to the bee colony, where all the individual actions of the ants and the bees emerge in this collective behavior that can be described in terms of seeking, fighting, searching, looking. So the worldwide mind is that kind of epiphenomenon. So the question I ask is, can this happen on that higher level where our collective actions as human beings create an independent entity of which none of us is consciously aware, that has its own sense of self? So that, at the highest level, is what I think of as the worldwide mind. I do draw on the philosopher Teilhard de Chardin and his thoughts about the noosphere to start talking about that kind of thing. Now, whether that's possible or not is a question I'll just set aside for the moment. Let me just say that, in a sense, we already have this happening now. If you look at Google, for example, so Google is a new kind of search engine in the sense that it doesn't itself go out and try to index everything.
Right.
What it does is it aggregates millions of human decisions about what websites are worth linking to. And that's what allows it to answer with uncanny accuracy all sorts of questions that are put to it. So it is an epiphenomenal kind of entity, which has a
You call it the frontal
process.
lobe. You call Google the frontal lobe of our...
Yes, right. It is, in a sense, putting together the actions of many people. And I draw out this analogy, say that you can think of Twitter kind of potentially as the beginnings of a collective amygdala. A collective amygdala. So in the brain, the amygdala is one of the parts that registers strong emotional responses or moderates emotional responses. It's not the only thing the amygdala does, but it's one of the things that it does. And so Twitter, in basically aggregating people's responses to things, their emotional responses, can be thought of as the aggregate of how people are feeling about something. So when Libya was embarking on its revolution, I was following all these tweets from Libya, and you could see people's shock and fear and horror and triumph in all the tweets that they were sending, and in Egypt and in Tunisia and so forth. And it was that emotional impact that really struck me, not just reading these reported stories from the New York Times, but the sense of, oh my gosh, all hell is breaking loose in Libya right now. That's the nascent beginnings of a collective amygdala.
You talk about this, you use this phrase, this term, telepathy, a great deal. And maybe that's a bit what you're talking about. And if you could distinguish that for me from telepathy, and what is telepathy?
Well, telepathy, of course, these are both mythical things right now, but telepathy is the ability to read someone's thoughts in a verbal sense. Okay, to know that you are thinking, okay, now I've got to go pick up my kid and get him to the soccer practice, and I'm wondering if it will rain. That's telepathy. And I set
How
that
did
aside.
you know?
Telepathy.
We did talk about it.
So I set that aside because we already have great technologies for transmitting that. They're called cell phones, right? But what's missing from the internet is feelings. It means what's missing from all these electronic technologies that we've built. The ability to know what someone else is perceiving and feeling. I was really drawing from Antonio Damasio's work in thinking about that, because Antonio Damasio, really more than anybody else, showed how crucial feeling is to intellectual thought. So he worked with these patients who were brain damaged in such a way that they could not have access to their emotions. And you would think that this would make them remorselessly efficient decision makers. In fact, it did just the opposite. They were completely helpless because they had no feelings to tell them what's important and what's not important. So they were paralyzed. Their rational ability was completely disabled when they lost their emotional drive. So you can think of the internet today, and I'm really saying not just all the wires and cables, but all the people, it's kind of like this feelingless entity because we don't have any way of transmitting the way people feel. We can transmit what they say, what they photograph, what they video, but not how they feel. So we are just missing that. And so I was drawing from the Mausian saying, if we could bring that back into that collective internet, then we have the makings of a conscious entity, because that will bring in the feelings that will give it some basis for rational, independent thought.
Right. You mentioned that there's a third book. Is that something I can ask you about?
Well,
you talked about this progression of blending your.
Well, I could talk about it only in a general sense, because I'm still working.
Because I'm curious where you're going with all this.
Well, it would carry forward this project of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So a big issue on my mind right now is there's so much talk of how we are disconnected, technologically disconnected, politically disconnected, emotionally disconnected. So I think I need to be writing about what brings us together. What do we have in common? So one of the things that I've been most interested in lately is how people communicate with animals. So I've been reading various books on ethology, the study of animal cognition, and really studying how humans communicate with animals. I was thinking, like, with our cats, we are from fairly different branches on the evolutionary tree. Okay, we're both mammalian, but I know how my cat is feeling. My cats know how I'm feeling. Where does that come from? Where it gets really interesting is when you get into more exotic creatures like the octopus, for example. So an octopus will blanch white when it's frightened and will blush red when it's angry. It will actually turn red. Now, I don't know for certain, but I think this has got to be because we share some DNA in common in terms of how our skin is constructed. Yeah. So we can know, in some sense, what an octopus is feeling by looking at it. So I'm interested in pursuing these questions. I'm trying to reach across these divisions of species, of politics. I mean, really right now, Republicans and Democrats are like alien species to each other. There's so much mutual anger and incomprehension. So one thing I want to write about is not just what do they have in common, because there's a bunch of books on that already. There's also a lot of books on how to try to basically game the system to favor one side or another. But the question is, how can these sides achieve a sense of kinship with each other? How is that possible? How can that be done? So these are the general thoughts that are going through my mind as I'm working on this next book.
Great. And since I teased it, I have to come back to your description of the iPhone as erotic, and we can spend the rest of the hour on that.
Well, think about it. So, well, my iPhone's over there, but first of all, you have to touch the thing to get it to work. So, every iPhone user discovers right away you can't use it with your gloves on. You can't poke at it with a stick, which is how you work with a Palm 5
right.
and the earlier devices. You've got to stroke the thing, right? You have to sort of pet it. And it kind of vibrates back at you. And there's a very erotic aspect to that experience. Now, the word eros, in its original Greek roots, literally just means that which brings together. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really meaning erotic in the sense of sexual. I mean erotic in the sense of it invites that kind of contact. Right. And you're invited to tilt in and to move in and to move around. So it becomes a very intimate kind of experience. You want to pet the thing, tickle it. So it's really interesting. I've been on bus trips where, like, I'm in the back of the bus. I'm seeing almost every single person in the bus going like this, okay? Basically, they're all petting these vibrating things in their laps. It's really quite an experience when you look at it from the back of the bus.
Right.
So it's a very sexy technology.
Yeah, they do have they have personality in a way that, I mean, I'm hooked to my BlackBerry, but the iPhone does have more personality. The way the games that my son Sebastian loves the car racing things, and the way you guide it that way is incredible. And you start off in the Palm universe, I recall.
Yeah, I had a BlackBerry.
Right.
Yeah, but originally
So
I've gone through the whole progression.
Yeah.
PDA, just like everybody else.
Yeah. Let's open it up to questions and comments. And Rebecca, wait for the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Rebecca McKinnon. I'm a fellow here. This is fascinating. I can't wait to read your book. And forgive me if I'm asking something that is clearly answered in your book. But I'm curious about the political and geopolitical implications of this possible trend, which sounds very possible. And in particular, I mean, we've already seen, and a lot of people have been looking at how specific choices by Facebook or Twitter or by Google affect what we know and what we cannot know, and also affect what we can and cannot do politically. Oftentimes, sometimes these engineering and design choices are not made with political motives, but end up having political implications, or choices about privacy policies. Similarly, whether somebody can be anonymous or not, who can see who is doing, and how much control you have over it, and how much you understand what your settings are, and all that kind of thing. There's also the issue of, if we were to enter into a world where, our Facebook account and our Twitter is somehow wired into our synapses, what does that mean for people in countries where these services are blocked because the governments do not want their citizens connecting globally quite so freely? And in some countries like China have developed or allowed the development of alternatives that are balkanized and separate. And just the extent to which, I'm just wondering what we do about all of this, or how, as citizens, we need to be thinking about how these technologies get regulated, as I think our digital selves and our physical selves inevitably get more integrated in some way or another, and how we make sure we understand what's happening, and we make sure that the political implications of, delightful technological innovations and don't end up having very unintended and unfortunate consequences.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. So I do talk about this at some length in my book. And as you point out, technology always has these unexpected consequences. I think I read just recently the Twitter people said, we never thought this was going to be a world-shaking political tool. They were just creating ways to send little 140-character microblogs. And boom, look what happens. And I don't think Tim Berners-Lee was anticipating that the World Wide Web would have the enormous tectonic consequences that it has had. So in the book, I do talk about the fact that you need to create social structures to allow people choices about their own privacy, and it goes the other way around to allow people access to these tools. And of course, that's a big issue now for companies like Twitter in the United States, is guaranteeing that service in another country effectively an act of, with quasi-military implications. Okay, is it trying to breach the great firewall of China? That is certainly a political act. So I think the big thing that I'm trying to bring to this discussion is that feelings are important. So that ability to empathize with another person. So a lot of what is wrong with politics today, as I see it, is that inability to truly listen to another person. This is totally non-technological. Okay, this is maybe a very different kind of answer than the question that you're asking. But I think technology matters the most when it gives you some kind of a window into what other people are feeling. I think that, for me, is why Twitter has been so powerful. Not because it gives me information about what's going on in Libya. That I can get from reading the New York Times and watching CNN, but rather how people are actually feeling at the moment. I think that has given people the ability for a kind of decision-making, which didn't exist before, that kind of empathetic sense of people are suffering, we need to do something. And to get that information unfiltered, that is, unfiltered through news agencies and through governments, rather directly from people, I think will enable a new kind of political force to be marshaled. So I think the impact is tectonic, just like you are pointing out. So to come back to the issue of empathy and feeling, I just think that's such an important thing to be talking about. And it sounds very, North Californian, it sounds very encounter groupy, but I think that's precisely why we have to talk about these things, precisely because we're uncomfortable talking about them. That politics always has limits where you are when you refuse to really listen to what another person is thinking, what they need.
We definitely don't talk enough about feelings at think tank events here in New America. Right here in the front.
Hi, Michael. My name is Jay Bonstingle, and I run a program in schools called Leaders for the Future, which is designed to promote just what you're suggesting, more a sense of empathy and a connection between the head and the heart, particularly for kids who are disenfranchised or who may not think of themselves as being anything special. I've actually two parts to my question. First is, what are the implications of what you've done, what your research has been, in terms of what we need to be doing in order to make education in this country and worldwide something that is actually effective? And secondly, I wonder if you'd comment on the idea that politics certainly seems to be more bereft of empathy than ever before, but it's also, I would suggest, more bereft of a moral core than ever before. And so where do you go in the world of politics and also in the world of education in terms of developing a civic awareness of the need for a moral core to align with our empathy? Because otherwise, what happens is that people get bamboozled by unscrupulous folks who want to prey upon them in an empathetic or seemingly empathetic way, but in point of fact, it's a fraud.
Well, I'm so delighted, first of all, to hear that you're doing this program, because I think it is so important to teach kids these kind of skills from an early age. You know, it's funny because I think David Brooks has been one of the most interesting people out in front of this discussion lately. Brooks has evolved in a really interesting way. You know, when I first started reading him 10 years ago, I really didn't like him. I mean, he was, you know, I thought he was speaking of this kind of namby-pamby neocon. And he's really evolved into a very interesting figure, you know, especially now that he's writing about neuroscience. So he wrote a column that came out just like a week ago or so, where he talked about the fact that one of the most important things to teach is the ability to inspire, the ability to lead. And these matter more in the long run in the educational system than things like calculus, which of course has to be taught. But the skills that stick with kids for their lives and really make a difference to them are those skills. And Google, they had this program. You know, again, this was just in the New York Times, I think a few days ago, where they were doing research into what makes the best kind of boss. And they found that technical skills are actually very low on the list. That the single most important thing is that ability to listen, to lead, to inspire, to understand what the problems are, to solve them. You know, these are the skills that really make good bosses and good communicators and good politicians to be really as good as they are at what they do, rather than narrowly based technical skills. So it's, you know, you've really answered the question that you've asked, that the answer really is to teach people these kind of skills starting at a very young age. You know, it's funny because in 5th grade, just a little story, I remember our teacher, who was this sort of big, bluff, tall, hardy guy, he actually taught us how to shake hands. And that's one of the biggest things that stuck with me from 5th grade. He said, you know, you reach out, shake someone's hand, you look in their eye, you smile, and he has to actually go around and shake hands with everybody else in the class. And I was thinking, wow, this is really cool. This is a very useful skill. And it has been one of the most useful things that I ever learned in 5th grade. So you've got the answer to your question, so please keep going.
You didn't solve the Republican-Democratic rift, though.
Hey, wait, I'm sorry.
You didn't solve the Democrat-Republican rift.
That's a tough one.
We're asking a lot of you here today, Michael.
That's a tough one. Yeah, I've been just thinking about that a lot because there is so much demonization going on both sides, really. So I don't have an answer yet. I've just been reading. So I just finished a book called, I think, The Political Mind by Drew Weston. You know, it's very, you know, his viewpoint is very progressive. You know, and his big point is that progressives have not learned to talk in a language that conservatives will resonate with. And he said that progressives think in terms of basically rationality, okay? To solve X, we need to do Y, Q, and Z. But that's not really what moves people, that they need to talk in that language of what reaches people's emotions. And when I first read it, I thought, okay, what he means that progressives need to start rabble-rousing and doing manipulation of emotions. But he explains very clearly that it's a lot deeper than that the good elocutionists, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, would talk about the crucial importance of reaching people's feelings, and that progressives need to learn how to do that. So that's like one little sort of corner. Okay, that's a piece of the puzzle. But where it goes from there, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question for you going forward in your next book, perhaps, is the question of, to what extent is partisanship compatible with telepathy when it, in its most evolved stages, or to Rebecca's earlier question, with sort of notions of national sovereignty. I mean, there's the worldwide mind when it gets to a certain point, and this is obviously something that a lot of people are wrestling with. How is that compatible with traditional notions of national sovereignty? But let me get other people in here. Right here in the middle.
You Grindstaff. I'm on Facebook, and some of my friends are like the president of Taiwan, some Arab journalists. I used to speak Chinese and read Chinese, but after years of not use, it's rusty. But I use Bing Translator to translate the languages, the difference in the languages, so much that I got a Facebook request from an Arabic-speaking person in Arabic, thinking that I spoke Arabic. But using the translator on Bing, it translates it for you. Sometimes you have to watch out for it. But yet, this is substituting my mind with Bing Translator. And how, you're going to see that this is a way of looking at people in different cultures in different ways by using the World Wide Web, but yet not using your own mind, too.
Well, this reminds me of Douglas Adams' Babelfish. The technology that allowed every culture to understand every other, and thereby caused more and bloodier wars than had ever been possible before. But I'm just joking there. But the thing about the worldwide mind, the way I write about it in this book is I write about it as emotional technology, which is non-linguistic. So that doesn't mean that it's. I'm not saying that's like a perfect language in which you perfectly understand people. I mean, but in fact, I'm careful in the book to say there's no such thing as enabling one person to perfectly understand another. We will always struggle with communicating, with understanding. But the idea of the worldwide mind at least will allow people to think about what does it mean to communicate in emotions. We do know that this is part of our shared human heritage, that we all have the same basic set. I think there are like 7 emotions, and that there's just various shadings among them, and they're universally shared across cultures. A smile is universally understood across all cultures. This has been researched by anthropologists and ethnographers. So I think that's an interesting way to think about it, to think about developing technology to help us connect in ways that we all know that we have in common. Things like cross boundaries of language, of culture, of ethnic origin, enables us to communicate in ways which we know we have something in common.
The back.
Well, your question touches on all sorts of interesting issues. So just to repeat the question as I understood it. So you're asking, well, we already know that language structures the way people think. And so what are the implications of worldwide mind technologies for that kind of discussion? Have I basically summed up what you're asking? So I've just read this fascinating book by Guy Deutscher called Through the Language Glass. And he addresses just this question. To what extent does language shape the way we think and the way we perceive the world? And he starts off by dismissing the Horphian hypothesis. So the linguist Benjamin Horp very famously hypothesized, I think back in the 30s, that some exotic American Indian languages like Hopi fundamentally made their speakers see the world differently than the way Westerners do. Well, Deutscher showed that was overstated, that languages don't fundamentally shape your perception such that the speakers of two different languages are mutually incomprehensible to each other. So the whole Horphian hypothesis is very much in doubt. But Deutscher does show that different languages require their speakers to pay attention to different things. And that's very interesting. So he shows that highly gendered languages, like Spanish, for example, which applies a male or female gender to every noun, they do invite their speakers to think about objects in fairly gender-oriented terms in the way that English speakers don't. And there's this very exotic language called matzes, where whenever you make a statement, you have to explain the evidentiary basis for that statement. So you can't just say, I saw a duck. You have to say, did you see the duck recently, or did you see it a long time ago? Did you yourself see the duck, or did you just hear about it from somebody else? These have to be explained in the grammar of the language. But the important point that Deutscher makes is that in all languages, there's still the capacity to completely explain the meaning of a statement in one language in another language. So a speaker of French could still understand what a person speaking this language, Matzes, is doing. They just have to have more stuff explained to them. So I think the important issue there, or the important insight there really, is that languages don't divide us as much as some linguists have thought. That there are always ways around this by explanation, by discussion, so that people from very different languages and very different cultures can still reach common understanding. Now, having said that, he also talks about the fact that because some languages are from a much smaller culture, they just don't have vocabulary to express a lot of key concepts. But even so, even in those cases, you still find analogies. So instead of using a word like telegraph, you come up with some way of explaining it that gets the other person to understand it. So the big thing that I drew from this book is that linguistic divisions are not as important as I have been led to think when I was in graduate school studying language and literature and linguistics. That's fascinating. So to come to your question after that long sort of roundabout kind of discussion is that we do know that things like facial expressions are universal. Feelings are universal. Now, I have a long discussion in my book where I talk about what does it mean to convey the information that someone else is happy. Okay. So if we come back to the fact that there seems to be roughly 7 basic emotions, anger, fear, joy, all those emotions. If I get information from you, from some kind of rig in your body, that you're feeling happy, does that mean that I know exactly how you feel happy or what you feel happy about? No, it doesn't do that. But it does give me a key bit of information. You are feeling a sensation of happiness. And that in itself is very important. In the book, I liken it to storytelling. So if you tell me a story of your childhood, that doesn't mean that I see the scene exactly the way you've described it. What I'm really doing is I'm taking my own memories of the things you talk about and sticking them into my visualization of the scene. So it doesn't mean that I perfectly understand you the way that you intended, but it means that we achieve some rapport, that we are communicating, that we feel some sense of connectedness. That's what matters in the end. So that's what I suggest that emotional communication can do. It doesn't let you live inside the body of another human being. It doesn't allow you to feel their pain or their joy exactly the way they feel it. But it does allow you to become aware of the fact that they are having those experiences. And that in itself is very important. Now, one more thing. Let me just point out, we already have an incredibly evolved technology for detecting those things. It's called the face, right? I can tell by looking at your face exactly how you feel. In fact, Paul Ekman has done a fascinating study of micro-expressions on people's faces. The important thing in the book is that these kind of technologies will allow us to get that information about people whom we are not in physical connection with, people who are in other places, and collective groups of people, how a group feels. So that kind of information may become available to us with this kind of hypothetical technology. To come back to your political question, that would have all these kind of political implications. If you know that a group is feeling angry or feeling confused, that information becomes very hard to ignore and becomes a factor in political calculations.
It's funny in talking about the face, how even with when we're online, we try to replicate that. If we're suddenly not clear that somebody we're writing might be aware that we're kind of being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, we put the little smiley face. So we're migrating that into emoticons. I think we have a question for a couple of more. Why don't we take both of them now, and then you can respond to both of them, and we'll wrap it up. So over
Well,
here.
let's take it one at a time. It's my short-term memory.
Okay, one at a time.
Two questions
yeah.
at once.
Scott Towsley. I read some work a while back that talked about the expectation or the possibility that human mental capacity had jumped at the point when man started worrying less about being chased by animals and more about engagement with groups of people, and that sort of accelerated things. Are we seeing an evolutionary jump here? What are your research implications of that? And specifically, is this something that's happening faster than natural evolution would expect, and what outcome do you see on that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There's the Flint Effect, which is this fact that IQ scores have been going up since IQ tests were invented. There's a lot of debate about what that actually means. But it seems to be pretty clear that if you gave a bunch of people, I think the year 1910, I forget the exact year, but if you gave them an IQ test normed today, their average score would be about 85. Okay, so there's a very interesting discussion about whether human intelligence is actually getting better. Okay, so I'm not going to get into all that, but there is that discussion going on. And there's also the Dunbar Limit, where there's this interesting discussion of the fact that we seem to have evolved to be able to keep track of roughly 150 people. And then we're not very good at keeping track of more people than that. And that's about the size of the early clans, basically 150 people. So it brings up two interesting questions. So are we in fact getting smarter? And the answer to that is maybe. I mean, there's certainly nutrition, education, there's all these factors that factor into people doing better on IQ tests. And as for the Dunbar Limit, could it be that we are poised on a sort of brink where we would be able to keep track of more than 150 people, sort of leap to a higher state where we can keep track of larger amounts of people as comfortably as we could 150 people? I don't know. I don't know the answer to those questions. I do know that distraction is a big issue. There's been some very interesting research lately showing that people don't multitask anywhere near as well as they think. So that when you try to get people to do two things, they're really just doing both of them more poorly. And there's a long discussion of multitasking in my book, where I talk about the fact that you can't just bombard them with more information. A possible solution is multiplexing, which is a very interesting distinction. When you multiplex, you're basically giving people information streams that occupy different parts of the cognitive sphere. So you can't listen to two people at once, but you can listen to a person and listen to music at the same time, because those are taking up different parts of your brain. That's multiplexing. So people are pretty good at multiplexing. But as for whether we are really on this kind of quantum leap, I don't know. But my response to that would be, in a sense, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter so much the native capability of the human brain. What matters is that we are building technologies that greatly leverage our ability to augment what we can do in the world. So one person today can learn more and write more and see more than anyone could have 200 years ago, simply because they have far more powerful tools at hand. So I might suggest that the unit of analysis is no longer really the individual, but rather the collective. And the important thing is to look at tools that empower that collective. That's where that next leap is coming from. And I would say we're well in the middle of that. That's going on right now. All these tools, Twitter, Facebook, email, have magnified our collective abilities tremendously.
Last question, the gentleman here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Doug Gage. When I saw the announcement for this event in your book, I was immediately reminded of Andy Clark's 2003 book, Natural Born Cyborgs. So is your book, it seems to me it might be more sociological, whereas his is more psychological, and you have the benefit of 8 more years of technology going. Is that right? Do you sort of think of yourself as building on his stuff?
Well, Natural Born Cyborgs is a wonderful book. So, and I was trying to incorporate that into Worldwide Mind. Because one of the most interesting things about Andy Clark's work is he tries to break down the boundaries of the skin. He says that we all sort of assume that we live in this skin bag, that what's in here is in here, what's out there is not us. And Clark shows that that division is far more permeable than we think. So I'm not actually fully convinced yet by that distinction, because I feel a very strong sense of I'm in here, you're out there. But obviously, okay, Worldwide Mind is very much about playing with these boundaries, about the boundaries of the skin, about the boundaries between our senses and the boundaries of technology. And so I actually have a whole bunch of drafts where I'm trying to work Andy Clark's ideas into my book. They just didn't quite fit. Okay, I just kept trying. I could not make it quite click in a way that got my book to do something that I couldn't do otherwise. But I definitely had Andy Clark's ideas in the back of my head as I was writing Worldwide Mind, because he is fascinating. He just came out with a new book more recently. I forget what it's called. I'm sure somebody in the audience remembers it. But that's been Clark's project, to undermine these distinctions between the self and the world, between technology and the body. And I've been just fascinated by that. I suppose I'm still trying to fully grasp that. And it's been interesting for me because, you know, I am a cyborg in the dictionary definition of the word, right? I've got 280,000 transistors in my skull. And when I was contemplating the surgery, it was very scary. I mean, I held the little circuit board in my hand, right? I mean, somebody opened up this cochlear implant so I could see the circuitry inside. I thought, oh my God, it really is a computer. And it's a computer chip with all these little resistors and, you know, all these little solder wires inside it. And it was like, okay, this is going to go inside my head. And so that was a very strange and eerie experience, to think the circuitry is actually going to go in me and do something useful for me. Will this feel natural? And it didn't at first. It took me about a year to learn how to actually hear with it in a way that felt like hearing. And it did mess with my sense of what's inside and outside, because there is this gadget in, and then every morning, you know, I just snap that on my hand, it just sticks there. And so there's this sort of permeability of all this data going into my head. It's about 1 million bits per second. It's about 1 megabyte per second of data going in. So I can't really say that I was able to use Andy Clark just this way, but I really wrestled with his writing and his ideas. And you will see some echoes of that in Worldwide Mind as I'm pondering these distinctions between inside and outside, self and other, technology and body.
Well, Michael, thank you very much, and congratulations on the book. There are copies outside for everybody, and I'm sure Michael would be glad to sign it. And it really is a terrific read, and this conversation has been great. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Thanks.